Welcome to a very special episode of JTV. Today, we're joined by a JTV regular and, frankly, one of our most popular contributors, historian Trudy Gold. We have been thinking about all the kind of topics in Jewish history that are so important to delve into. And we have loads of ideas that we want to do for programs. And one of the topics that I've been keen to do as a British Jew, Trudy also as a British Jew, is the story of Britain and the Jews. I think a lot of people, both Jewish and non-Jewish, know some of the big themes in Jewish history, certainly with our connection and expulsion from the land and return and things like the Holocaust and the Inquisition, but less known about some of those particular areas Jews traveled to, the communities they built up, the things that happened, both good and bad. And one of those big things, I think, is the story of Britain. Britain, the Jews, not so well known, the story, both because there were actually two settlements there, and we decided to make this into a two-part series. We'll start with part one, the first settlement, the medieval era, and then the second settlement, where the Jews were, after having been expelled, were allowed to return under Cromwell. And actually, contrary to what many are aware, many of the themes in Jewish history originate in Britain, in England, whether it's blood libel, whether it's, the rise of Zionism and the return of the Jews. So much happens here. And so I think it's an absolutely fascinating story that we need to get clued up on. And who better than to talk to Trudy about it? So the way we've decided to do this is, as I say, today will be the first settlement of the Jews in England. And then I'll prod Trudy every so often, but I'm really going to give Trudy free rein just to educate us. And then, as I say, we'll do part two in the second part. So Trudy, thanks as ever for joining us, and take it away.
Thanks, Ollie. I think at a time when the Jewish world is in such a state of flux, when in fact the whole world is such a state of flux, it's very important to go back into history and to try and find the causation to the kind of world that we have today as far as the Jews are concerned. Because certainly, if one goes to the end of the 19th century, when Theodor Herzl had his first Zionist Congress, the Congress was actually opened by Max Nordau, who said there is only one country in the world which is free from the taint of anti-Semitism. That country is England. And if you think of England in the 19th century, it was the empire that ruled the world. God was an Englishman, to quote a very famous book of the time. They'd had a Jewish prime minister. Yes, of course, Benjamin Disraeli had converted, but he said, all is race, there is no other truth. Benjamin Disraeli threw his Jewish origins in the face of anyone who opposed him. In a debate in Parliament over Jewish emancipation, he actually got to the floor and he said, how can you not emancipate the Jewish people when half the world worships a Jew and the other half is mother? Disraeli, Montefiore, who, if you like, was the Statlan of the Jewish world whenever Jews were in trouble in the 19th century. He lived for over 100 years, which is wonderful for a historian. He was a close friend of Victoria's, and whenever he went to help Jews in trouble, he went with the blessing of the British Crown. So England certainly was seen as very special in the 19th century. Today, of course, the Jewish world faces exactly the same problems that we're facing in every part of the world. And the question is very much to the fore is, can a Jew really be loyal to Britain? Who would have thought that in 2025, when Jews has given so much to British society, that again is a question. And sticking my neck out, I would say that of all the minority groups in this country, we are the most that is under threat. And it's under threat not just from the extreme right, but it's also under threat from the left, and I'm going to go further, from the liberal left. So how did it all happen? Before I get on to that, I want to say that as a Jew, and as a Jew who has been steeped in the history, it will pass. So for Jewish listeners, and also for our friends who are listening, this too will pass. But I think by examining the history of the Jews of Britain, you'll get a flavour of what the Jewish world was like. So I'm going back to that most famous date in British history. in English history. Everyone knows when William the Conqueror crossed the Channel and defeated and defeated Harold at the Battle of Hastings. And ironically, that is the king who invited Jews to Britain. To understand why, you have to, and when I say Britain, I should say England, because nobody penetrated into the wilds of Scotland at this period. Now, it's important to understand the role of this very strange, small, tiny people in Western history. In fact, in the history of the world, the Jews had been exiled from their own country by the Romans. They had spread throughout the Roman world. And the first really important event that affected Jewish history was the rise of Christianity. One of the problems that Jews are going to face in the world of monotheism, in the world of Christianity, and later in the world of Islam, they both see themselves as the inheritors of the Jewish tradition. If you think of the prophets of Islam, Suleiman is Solomon, Moses is Musa, the feast of Musa. They have taken it on, even more with Christianity, because Yeshua of Nazareth, who was probably a wonder rabbi, we will never really, as a historian, know the facts because there isn't enough evidence. His story is told in the Gospels, which means good news, and the first Gospel was written 40 years after his death. So will we ever, as a historian, be able to deal with it? But certainly, if you take St. Matthew's Gospel, there is a terrible line in it when the crowd screamed to Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, "May his blood be upon us and upon our children." What happens is that by the time Christianity goes on the march, beginning in 325, the last country in Europe to be Christianized was actually Lithuania in 1387. Christianity was an incredibly successful religion because it promised salvation. All you had to do was believe and you would inherit God's kingdom. And because what happens is the gospel writers and later church fathers living under Roman rule are not going to blame the Romans for the death of Jesus. They blame the Jews. Now, there is absolutely no real evidence for this because crucifixion was a Roman method of execution. But all you have to do is read the Gospels and you will see the blame. And what happens is that gradually, through Christian writings, the Jews are the pariahs. And this coincides, of course, with the decline of the Roman Empire. Rome declines, but Christianity goes on the march. So country after country becomes Christian. The church is the other power. The church in Rome, based on the teachings of St. Peter. There's a line in the Gospels where Jesus says to Peter, "Thou art Petros, my rock, and upon this rock will I build my church." Rome becomes the center. And what is going to happen in the Christian world, right up really until the modern period, is the clash between the church and the state. Now, Christianity had an overarching power in the countries that had been conquered. What do I mean by that? People lived in a religious worldview. I don't know what went on in the hearts and minds of anyone who lived in Britain in the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th centuries. Very few people wrote it down. Who were the chroniclers? The church. Who were the scribes? The church. And everyone had to go to church. A mainly illiterate peasant population. And what were they told every Easter? Gentle Jesus was murdered by the evil Jews. And every guild, every trade was a Christian trade. And by 9/11, Jews had been squeezed out of any normal kind of livelihood because all guilds were Christianized. And the Jews were an irritant because this people did not give in. They worshipped in a strange tongue, a strange God, and they believed that theirs was the path. Now, what's this got to do with British history? Why did William the Conqueror invite them in? Because there were two powers the power of the church and the power of secular kings. Now, obviously, kings would play lip service, and some were very pious and others weren't. There was a very interesting device in the Catholic Church. When you died, you went to purgatory, where your sins were weighed up. If you perform good deeds like giving tithes to the church, and later on going on a crusade, you could buy time out of purgatory and sit with the saints. If you didn't, you died in hell. And all you have to do is look at Dante's Inferno, and the depictions of it. Hell was a very, very dark place. So, consequently, this was the power that the church had. And in 800, the church actually appointed a secular ruler, Charlemagne, to be the Holy Roman Emperor. The church was a very acute political being, and they would use the most important, strongest kings to be their champions. But turning to Britain, England, William the Conqueror, William was a conqueror, and he was pragmatic. The role that the Jews had adapted in society, remember, they're international, they're literate. They're a very small people, but from country to country, they are literate. If you take, for example, the Radhanites, these were merchants who probably came out of northern Spain and went all the way to Kaifeng in China. Because don't forget, even in times of war, those of you who are interested in costume, look at the silks, look at the laces, look at the jewels. These are all about imports. The Jews become the major merchants. The Radhanites were Jews. A lot of new communities were created on the Silk Route to China. And something else, from the rise of Islam, right up until 1683, and this is very important to understand today, there was war between Islam and Christianity. They're both, Islam is the baby of the monotheistic religions. The view of Islam is Jews and Christians are people of the book, so they don't have to be converted. Everyone else does. Pagans must be converted by sword. Islam is a converting religion. Christianity is a converting religion. The clash, and it goes on through 8 crusades to the last real battle, when the forces of Islam were defeated at the gates of Vienna in 1683. There was more or less 1,000 years of warfare. Of course, they're not battles and wars all the time, but the countries were at war. Now, who do you think was crossing over from Christianity to Islam? Who could trade? The Jews. And ironically, Jews lived better in the main. I'm making a huge assumption here, but in the main, Jews lived better under Islam. Islam said no Jew can rule or Christian can ever rule over a Muslim. And because Christianity was the enemy, Christians fared very badly amongst his Muslims. But if you take, for example, one of the great periods of Jewish history, it was under Islam in Spain, where Jews could be grand viziers, foreign ministers, Jews could run armies. So Jews are traders, Jews are merchants, sometimes they're ambassadors, and they are also money lenders, because money is useful. The church forbade it. They took, ironically, a Jewish law and for a Levitical law and forbade to be money lenders. Later on, they're going to get round it. By about the 1300s, they're going to get round it. But for a long period, the Jews were the money lenders. So they're associated with money, they're associated with trade. The irony of this is they weren't allowed to do anything else. So why did William the Conqueror bring them into England? And he invited them in. He knew them already in Rouen. There was a Jewish settlement in Rouen. In fact, a few years ago, a mikveh, if you like, the ritual bathing house, was found in Rouen. And he invited them in. Why? Because they could be useful. And I'm going to read you the statute. In the 4th year of William the Conqueror's reign, he held a council of his barons, in which, amongst other things, it was provided that the Jews settled in this kingdom should be under the king's protection, that they should not subject themselves to any other without his leave. It is declared that they and all their belongings belong to the king, and if any should detain them or their goods, he might challenge them as his own. Now, for the first 3 Norman kings, William I, his son William Rufus, and William Rufus gets a terrible press from the church chroniclers because he wasn't religious. He was probably a homosexual, and we know he entertained Jews at court. We know this from the rabbis because they complained that there was drinking amongst the Jews of the Isle. They were a very tiny percentage of the population. The majority would have lived in London, but they were useful. And we know that under the Normans, the king took a percentage. Any debt owed to the Jews, the king took a percentage. They're under his protection. And under the Normans, Jewish taxes amounted to 20% of the annual revenue. Now, they're useful. They did. And if you've got to think also, would Jews have
That's
mixed with?
astonishing. 20%.
Yeah, 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 yeah. 15,000 of them. Look, think what England was. William sets up, look, the majority of the population are peasants, okay? Who could read and write? Clerics, the nobility. Now, the nobility, what William did was he brings over his favourite Normans. They usurp the land of the Saxons. Look, this is the time of, later on, it's Robin Hood, it's Ivanhoe, it's all the dream time of British history. But the reality was he sets up the Doomsday Book. He wanted to find out all his possessions. He set up the feudal pyramid. At the top is the king. He leases the land to the barons. The church is a separate entity. And then you have the peasantry. And the peasantry are tied to the land. They lived miserable, mean lives. The average life expectancy of a peasant in Norman England, what do you think it was? And it also meant that there wasn't much mixing.
Yeah. By the
Because
way, when you presumably Jews had a much higher literacy, would they have been literate in the language of
well,
Old
we
English
know that they
as
spoke
well as
Norman
Hebrew?
French. I'm going, if you want me to, Ollie, I actually, if I can find it, I have a fascinating document, which is a Jewish code of education for England. And
What I'm saying is,
basically,
did these communities engage in sort of secular study as well as religious study?
mm,
What I'm
they would
asking
have,
is, did yeah,
yes, well, look, the point is they would have spoken Norman French. We know that because remember, marriages were arranged, rabbis came over from France. They would have spoken the language. When you say secular subjects, this has always been a
right,
complication. What may a Jew study? There's a wonderful line, never forget there is wisdom amongst the Gentiles. This is the Torah. No, the
yeah,
Talmud, I beg your pardon. But there is no,
Talmud, yeah,
there is wisdom amongst the Gentiles, there is no Torah. We know that they would have studied mathematics because that helps. They would study
yeah,
astronomy. That helps.
sure.
But the philosophy of the West, well, at this time, the philosophy of Greece and Rome had been lost because the church had
Mm,
forbidden it. The church, that's another story for another time. But basically, there wouldn't have been much for them to mix with.
mm, yeah,
So they would have lived their own lives, and everything was quite good for them for the first 3 Norman kings. Why? Because they are under the protection of 3 very important kings, very strong kings, who quite like them, and they were
And Trudy,
useful.
where were these Jews coming from when
France.
William said let them in? They came from
He
France, and
sent them over from
what would
France.
have? Oh, did he force them over, or
No, no,
and
no,
if
no. He had his kingdom. Remember, he was William of Normandy, and Jews were living in Rouen. Jews were a nomadic people. They would go wherever they were safe. And France at this time is not a kingdom as we know it today. There were different parts of France. And
right?
there were Jews at this period. The best place for them to live was right down in the south on the
Mm,
Spanish borders.
mm,
And there was a lot of, because remember, Spain was, at the time of William the Conqueror, Spain was Islamic.
yeah.
So, and in cities like Carcassonne, Narbonne, Albi, which later on would be centres of Christian religious dissent, heresy, there were a lot of Jews living there quite happily. In Spain, provided Islam was secure, the Jews did well. So,
But they moved to England for safety reasons. What you're
well,
saying,
there are opportunities. They're invited in. You see,
right?
in Rouen, they were happy because they're under the protection of a strong king. When I say happy as any, but they were safe. They come
Yeah.
to England because he invites them in, and because they can earn a living. They many lords employed Jews as well. Because think about the kind of nobility of the time, the aristocracy, the old Norman knights. What would they be like? Hunting,
Mm.
shooting, fishing, maybe, but mainly fighting. And something else you should know: 1096 is the first crusade, and that led to a huge upswing in anti-Jewish prejudice. A weak pope summoned the Christian monarchs to crusade. Now, the Norman kings didn't go.
Mm.
And in the path of people going from Europe to what they called the Holy Land, to wrest it from who? The Muslims. They could gain their place in heaven, but the mob are whipped up. Why go all the way to the Holy Land to murder Jews, to murder Muslims, when you can murder Jews in on the way? And there were terrible massacres in France, particularly in the Rhineland, where there were huge Jewish communities in the Rhineland going back to Roman times. Massacre after massacre after massacre. So Jews came into England. They came into England from parts of France, from parts of Germany. So they were going where they could be. This is about Jewish powerlessness. And you know what I find fascinating? We've always got this notion that Jews have got power. It's absolute balderdash. Jews could live reasonably provided the king kept them safe. But then everything goes wrong. And it goes wrong because Henry I dies without a male heir. His son dies in a terrible storm on the Channel. Why on the Channel? Because he's going William of Normandy. He's going to the other possessions, and he and his companions. In fact, there's a very good book called The White Ship, ironically written by Earl Spencer, the
Mm.
brother of Princess Diana. He's a very, very good historian, and it tells the story. William is so Henry I of England, who was a very interesting king. He was a great lawgiver. He kept England very safe. He he was the youngest son of William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror, then William Rufus, the second son, who never married, never had children. And so the brother takes the throne, very strong. These people, yes, of course, outwardly they were religious, but they were rulers. They didn't send England on crusade. And then he dies without an heir. And then he has a daughter. Can a queen rule in England? Salic law. There was a cousin who also claimed the throne. So what you're going to have for 20 years is a period of civil war. And the Jews lose the
Mm.
protection of the king. And not only that, the various barons and knights are up to their necks in debt because they're fighting each other. They need to arm their knights, they need to arm their serfs. So, what do they need? Money, gold. And where do they get it from? The Jews. Consequently, you have the first real attack against the Jews with the blood libel. The first blood libel in Norwich. Now, I'm sure your viewers all know the blood libel is one of the most appalling accusations ever put against a people, that they use the blood of babies for their Passover bread. Easter and Passover. The last supper the Christians called was probably the first night Seder. Now, anyone who knows anything about Judaism will know about blood taboo and
Yeah,
ritual law.
yeah.
So, where did the blood libel come from? Christianity was an incredibly interesting religion in how it spread. It incorporated many pagan beliefs. If you think about the mistletoe, that's a druid symbol. If you think about the halo, that's Mithras. Christianity was very good at adapting paganism. I often spend time in Cornwall. Nearly every church in the west of Cornwall is on an old pagan site. It's
Mm,
fascinating.
mm,
So think about how pagans viewed the world. Some worship the wind. There's a brilliant book by Campbell, The Masks of God, where he said half the world worship the Sky Mother, the other the Earth Father. What does the peasant need? What does the pagan population want? They want harvest to be able to eat. They need to appease the gods. Think Stonehenge. Now, we know that child sacrifice, what is the greatest sacrifice? The blood of a child or of a virgin. And we also know that this accusation, in the early years of Christianity, when there were sects quarreling with each other, they would make that accusation. It's the worst thing. In 1144, it is applied to the Jews. And we know a lot about it. It was in Norwich. And it was a priest whipped up by zeal at Passover when gentle Jesus is murdered by the evil Jews. A child goes missing, the local baron in cahoots, the mob go on the rampage, they burn the Jewish section of the town, they burn the wooden houses of the Jews. Everyone's got wooden houses, which have in them the wooden chests of debts. So the debts are nullified. It's a double win. And I'm going to read you the testimony of Thomas of Monmouth, which later on, a Christian chronicler, what he had to say about the blood libel. Jews of Spain assembled every year in Narbonne, where their royal seed flourished, in order to arrange the annual sacrifice prescribed in the ancient writings of their fathers, to show contempt for Christ, to revenge themselves because Christ's death had made them slaves in exile, and to arrange their freedom and return to their own land. They had to shed blood annually by sacrificing a Christian child. Each year, the Jews of Narbonne cast lots to determine the country in which the town the sacrifice would be performed. The lot fell on Norwich in 1144, and all the synagogues in England knew and consented to that act. This is from an Anglo-Saxon chronicle of 1155. In King Stephen's time, Stephen and Matilda, the Civil War, the Jews of Norwich brought a Christian child before Easter and tortured him with all the torture that our Lord was tortured with, and on Good Friday hanged him on a cross on account of our Lord and buried him. Our Lord made plain he was a holy martyr. The monks buried him, and he works wonderful and varied miracles, and is called Saint William. In fact, Thomas of Monmouth, who is writing, he was a Benedictine monk. He was a Benedictine monk. So it's important to know that these characters, much of the horror stories comes from the monastic orders that were created. And don't forget, the universities and later Oxford and Cambridge are created by monks.
mm.
Now,
But Trudy, just a question: are you saying that this blood libel was a contrived effort to extrapolate money from the Jews? Is that
to actually destroy the debts.
to destroy the debt? So is there, the fact that this was started? You say it was by a bishop. Was he in cahoots with with the monarch, or do we?
Seems so, yes. Not
Hmm,
with the monarch, with the local lord. It's the
the
lord, you
local
see,
one.
that we're in civil war. There's no central
Right,
authority. Jews are
right, right.
safe under William I, William Rufus, and Henry. In fact, he wants them safe because he takes a huge percentage of any debt.
Yeah. Yeah.
They are useful to the king,
Right.
and
Right.
then it goes away.
But what
But
you're saying is that this is not primarily actually, contrary to what it may seem, it's not primarily theologically driven, it's economically driven. Is that what you're saying?
there's always a blend with the Jews.
It's a
It's
blend. It's a
always a
blend.
blend.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the blood libel, which begins in Norwich, the most famous blood libel, is in the reign of Henry III, which that's the Hugh of Lincoln. And why is it famous? Because it's immortal. Jews are thrown out of England in 1290 by Edward I. When I studied A-level English literature, in my day, we had to do a Chaucer and Shakespeare paper.
Same.
Chaucer, the Canterbury Tales, a
Hmm.
group of pilgrims going to the tomb of Thomas a Becket in Canterbury, telling each other stories. One of the stories is the most famous blood libel in English history, the story of Hugh of Lincoln. It is immortalized in the Canterbury
Mm.
Tales.
Mm.
What if I tell you there is no positive image of a Jew anywhere in European literature until the Enlightenment, when a fascinating German writer called Lessing writes a play called a play called The Jews, and it fails on the Berlin stage because no one can imagine a Jew can be a hero.
Mm.
It's this negative stereotype. And
Mm.
you see, one of the problems we face is that the main roots of Jew hatred today, they can trace their origins back to all of this. Now, I'm I'm not a fantasist. I do not believe that the majority of non-Jews go around thinking Jews are Christ killers. But what I believe is it's seeped into a culture.
Yeah.
And ironically, Islam was free of the blood libel until it's pushed in mainly
Mm.
by French Christians in the 19th, early 20th century. And later on, Islam picked up all of this from Soviet Russia and from Nazism. So it comes, and so
Yeah.
this kind of thing with the blood libel is so relevant today in the Arab world, and they found references to it in Gaza, by the way. This is one of
Yeah.
the most terrible
Sure.
tropes against the Jewish
Sure.
people, and it
Sure.
originates in England. But you see, history moves on, and the new king, what happens is, in the end, the throne is taken by Henry II of England, who is the son of Matilda, and he rules. He marries.
What year is this, Trudy?
He becomes king in 1154. It ends the Civil War. And
Hmm.
he's king between 1154 and 1189. He marries the extraordinary Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was the richest heiress in France. The whole of that area was controlled by her. And she brought to England much civilization and courtliness. The troubadours of the French courts. I mean, many of your viewers will know about this. It's a fascinating area. Now, he ruled over a huge territory in England and France. He was incredibly clever. He knew theology, he knew languages, he knew art, he knew architecture, and he had huge problems with the church. He was a secular ruler married to the richest heiress in the world. And she'd actually been first married to the King of France. Fascinating. To read a biography of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine is a wonderful romp of a read. Now, we know that Henry II had no problems with Jews whatsoever. And all sorts of scholars, they thrived under Henry II. And he believed very, very strongly in ideas. And we think that probably Jewish scholars came to court. So he's a completely different character. On the other, and the Jews were useful because he's fighting a lot of wars. And in fact, the richest man in England at the time was a man called Aaron of Lincoln. In fact, his estate was too tempting for Henry, and he did take the whole of his estate when he died. It was £100,000. Now,
Right. Wow.
it ironically,
Aaron of Lincoln is a Jew?
yeah, Aaron of Lincoln, he was the rich, and he had a stone house. They learnt their lessons. He was the
Mm,
richest man in England. He was a
mm,
debt collector. He endowed land. We know that. He was a fascinating character. And in fact, he took the 100,000 and he sent much of the treasury to France, and the boat sank. But the church but the church owed, and the barons owed Aaron £15,000, and the king had to open up a separate branch of the treasury just to take that money in. And by that time, Jews had settled in nearly all the major towns of England. In London, they lived in a place called Old Jewry, and it's very much the Golden Age. He allowed Jews to govern themselves. He extended his grandfather's Charter of Protection, and the church chroniclers were very unhappy. Let me read you. Remember, the chroniclers of the reign are clergymen, and he was the king whose best friend was a man called Thomas à Becket. He wanted to control the power of the church, so he made Thomas à Becket Archbishop of Canterbury. Thomas all of a sudden becomes pious, and in the end, Henry loses patience with him, and he loses his temper, and 4 of his knights go and kill Thomas à Becket. And Henry is forced to make pilgrimage to the shrine of Thomas à Becket. He is canonized by the church. And of course, the Canterbury Tales. So you see how it all comes circle. Now, this is a chronicler of Henry II's time. By an absurd arrangement, they were happy and renowned far more than Christians, swelling very impudently against Christ, and through their good fortune did much injury to Christians. And we know that their activities expand to towns in England, to Exeter, Bedford, Devizes, Ipswich, and Canterbury. And also, because of their international connections, Jews from Spain would come over, Jews from the German lands would come over. So this is a time where you have a very clever king,
mm.
a very clever queen, although they quarrel with each other, and he imprisons her for a large part of the reign. And as I said, it appears that we know that Abraham Ibn Ezra visited, and it's quite likely he went into conversation with Henry II. And Frederick Barbarossa, who of course was the German emperor, he complained that too many of his most lucrative subjects were leaving Germany for England. And in 1171, in his reign, there was a blood libel in France, in Blois. And in fact, it was a real Theobald the Count had a Jewish mistress, and his wife was so upset about it that she actually trumped up the blood libel. And as a result of that, 30 Jews were burnt at the stake. The rest of them were the ransom was paid by a rabbi, but many of them fled to England. So they Jews were merchants, they're dealing in corn. Think the woolsack and in wool. Think the woolsack, the Chancellor of England today sits on the woolsack. Why? It's the wealth of England. They were also pawnbrokers. They developed skill in the making of jewelry, and they're codependent on the Gentile community. But one of the problems was that the Gentiles would go to the Jews, maybe pawning their most precious possessions, like the gold wedding ring. So there is hostility that is fanned by religiosity. We also know there was occasional intermarriage. So Henry II's reign is, if you like, a golden age. But then
It's
this is
is
this
his
is
is his reign before after the massacre at York?
no, I'm coming on to that.
Okay.
Because he dies in 1189. He had lots of quarrelsome sons, and his son, Richard I, becomes King of England. Richard I, the great crusader, he is determined to go on crusade to the Holy Land against Saladin. So there's a huge upswing in church power, and also a lot of resentment against the Jews for the reign of Henry II. And this is Isaac Disraeli. Now, Isaac Disraeli, Benjamin Disraeli's father, was a man of letters, as the British would say, and he wrote a story of what happened in Richard the First's reign. Because what happens is, when he is crowned, the Jews go to take a present to him. And the rumor goes around that they plan to kill the king. Well, the truth is, everyone's up to their necks in debt to the Jews because the knights and barons are going to go with the king on crusade. So what happens is there is a bloodbath in London, and it spreads. And it spreads to York, where the Jews of York, they go to the governor for protection, and they're in Clifford's Tower, but they can't be protected. And this is Isaac Disraeli. The people of York soon gathered to imitate the people of London. The alarmed Jews hastened to Gesenius, the most opulent of the Jews, who conducted them to the governor of York Castle and prevailed on him to afford them an asylum for their persons and effects. The castle had sufficient strength for their defence, but a suspicion arose that the governor, who often went out, intended to betray them. So the Jews come together, and the Jewish council was assembled. The rabbi rose. We know that his name was Yom Tov Joini, rabbi from France, and he said, "Men of Israel," remember I'm quoting Isaac Disraeli, "the God of our ancestors is omniscient, and there is no one who can say, why dost thou do this? This day he commands us to die for his law, so that law which we have cherished from the first hour it was given, which we have preserved pure throughout our captivity in all nations, from which, because of the many consolations it has given us and the eternal hope it communicates, can we do less than die?" And basically, the story of York, they commit Kiddush Hashem. Suicide is banned in Judaism, but if it's in the name of the Almighty, Kiddush Hashem, and the rabbi and the Jewish elder are the last to die.
And
The
how did
rabbi
they die?
kills Josephus and then takes his own life. A couple of people came out, and that's how we know the story. And that is the massacre of York. This is what happens. Rather, the mob were baying at the streets. They knew it was that they would be murdered or forced to convert. So they commit Kiddush Hashem. And
So the massacre of York was actually indirectly suicide, basically.
rather than give in to the mob, rather than be
And was
killed or converted,
and how were they killed?
they killed
How did
themselves. The women, the children were killed by the men, who then killed each other, and the last to die was the rabbi. It's a terrible,
what,
terrible thing. Kiddush Hashem, sanctification of the name,
wow,
because
like Masada.
and the rabbis proclaimed a herem on the city of York, and it wasn't lifted until 1989, 1,000 years later, where there was a ceremony of reconciliation between the Archbishop of Canterbury and the chief rabbi of the time. It's
Wow.
a terrible blot.
Wow, wow, wow.
So, as what I'm saying to you, this really does illustrate the the powerlessness of the Jew. If you've got a strong protector, you're fine. If not, you're at the mercy of the church. And
Yeah.
also, the crusading fervor had led to the good development of these monastic orders, like the Dominicans, the Hounds of God, Black Friars, Grey Friars, those of you who know London, White Friars. These were the lands. The
Hmm.
church had huge power. Now,
Yeah.
the king
Trudy,
that
do we know
Richard,
if did the you're about sounds like you're about to get onto the king. Did the king endorse what was happening?
oh, he was furious, actually. Yeah, because they were the king's Jews.
Right.
But he was off on crusade against Salah ad-Din, the great courtly Muslim knight, king, or vizier. And what is interesting about Salah ad-Din, there is a story. One of Saladin's doctors was a man you will know well, Maimonides, and which Richard was wounded. And the story goes that Salah ad-Din lent him Maimonides.
Hmm.
And Richard asked Maimonides to come back to England, but he refused. Now, Jews were also doctors. I should have mentioned that. Much of their medicine, and so were the Arabs. The Arab world at this time was far in advance of Christianity, intellectually. Much of the learning of Greece and Rome, particularly after the sack of Constantinople, was kept alive by the translators who were Jews and Muslims. So you've got so many fascinating stories. And of course, that's a lovely legend. And there's another legend. Whilst Richard was away, his mother, the extraordinary Eleanor of Aquitaine, was the regent. But he had and you've got to know that Henry and Eleanor had had lots of children and they quarreled horribly. His younger brother, John, wanted the throne badly. And there's almost a civil war. So there's a lot of instability. And Richard, coming back from the crusade, is actually imprisoned by one of the German princes, one of his allies. And they have to get him back. So the Jews want him back. Money is collected. You can't send money over the sea. It's dangerous. Think what happened to the treasure of Aaron of Lincoln. So what they do is they issue a promissory note on the Jews in this German land. It's the first promissory note in history. And the probably when Aaron of Lincoln died is probably the court of the Star Chamber. Star is a Hebrew for debt. So lots of interesting stories. So, but of course, he dies. He's wounded. He dies, and John comes to the throne. He gets a very bad press from the English chroniclers, and in his reign, he can't control the barons. He's a very weak king, and it's in his reign you have Magna Carta, which has gotten, I never forget. People say it's the sign of British democracy. It's rubbish. What it's about is the barons taking control from the king. But three of the clauses, your students, our listeners can do a bit of homework. Three of the clauses are about the Jews and their debts. So it gives you a notion of how important the Jews were in the structure of British society. Again, the tide of history turns. John is succeeded by his son, Henry III, who comes to the throne as a very young boy. He's 9 years old. He's also very, very pious. It's not until 1235 that he rules England personally. He has a regent, William Marshal. He is so pious. He builds he builds lots of church. There's a lot of church buildings. He redoes Westminster Abbey, and many of the Oxford colleges. Eton is in his reign.
Wasn't there a female Jewish financier that was involved in Westminster Abbey
Yes,
and Westminster?
Licoritia, yeah. Jewish women, you've got to remember, men studied. Jewish women and Licoritia, there were quite a few of them. It's another tale, the role of women. But Jewish women often, their husbands would leave them the debts to collect. And they were very canny business women. And later on, and particularly in Eastern Europe, it was the women who looked after the businesses while the men studied Torah and Talmud.
Yeah, yeah.
But Henry III, he comes to the throne in 1207. He takes power in 1235. And ironically, he's the most obsessive patron of the arts ever to have occupied the English throne. It's in his reign that he is very much under the sway of one of the most powerful popes in British history, in church history, a pope called Innocent III. Innocent III, and I want to, I'm going to read you a couple of extracts from his letters. He extends the scope of the crusade, not just against the Muslims, but also against the heretics. You've heard of the Cathars, the Albigensian crusade in the south, where these characters, they were interesting, the Cathars. They wanted to go against the power of Rome, the riches of Rome. They believed Christianity poor Christians, they should be poor. Blessed are the poor, said Jesus. And
Mm.
this is a threat to the church. The church suppresses any kind of threat. Now, this is his letters. The Jews, like the fratricide Cain, are doomed to wander through the earth as fugitives and vagabonds. Their fates must be covered in shame. This is the legend of the wandering Jew that becomes so important in literature. Now, he writes a letter to the King of France talking about the evil perfidy of the Jews, but more important, the Lateran Council. And the Lateran Council says that Jews and Muslims who live in the West, in the church lands, must be set apart. There can be no intermarriage. He wants to clean up the church as well. So he's revered as a great pope, but
Mm.
he sets up the wearing of the Jew badge. And England is the first country at the Council of Oxford to implement the wearing of the Jew badge. Also, in his reign, the Domus Conversorum is set up, the House of Conversions. Any Jew who converted to Christianity could live, it was in Chancery Lane, could live in this house free, but they were paid money to convert. Also, in his reign, the most famous blood libel in English history, which of course is the blood libel of Lincoln. And I remember going to Lincoln Cathedral with the famous Robert Wistrich, the great historian. And we wanted, because there used to be a plaque that wasn't taken down until 1959, talking about sweet St. Hugh who'd been murdered by the Jews. Many of these blood libel characters become saints in the Catholic Church. Now there is a plaque that says there are certain episodes that do not redound to the faith of Christianity, etc.
Mm.
So in his reign, it's really, really bad. And he's taxing them, and he's taxing them, and he's taxing them. So much so. And also you begin to see the rise of Christian banking houses, the Fuggers. Later on, it's going to be the great Medici clan. They're getting round the law. The Jews are beginning to outlive their financial usefulness. So that when Henry III's son, Richard I, Edward I, comes to the throne, Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, the man who makes his son Prince of Wales, he tries to make the Jews more useful. He doesn't. He thinks they can no longer be moneylenders. They've got to become farmers. It doesn't work. And in the end, they are expelled from England. The Edict of Expulsion is given on Tisha B'Av, and no Jew can be in England on the 1st of November 1290. Think religious calendar. What is the 31st of October? Walpurgis night, the night of the witches. What is the first? All Saints' Day. No Jew could be in England on All Saints' Day. So they're given 3 months' notice, and we know some stayed behind, some would have converted, some would have blended in. We know there were about 5,000 by this time. So many of them already fled. It was so bad in the last two reigns. And they probably would have gone to France, French lands, still divided, through the German lands, and many of them would have finished up in Poland, because interestingly, the Polish kings were becoming very powerful. In 1387, the pagan king of Lithuania married the 12-year-old Polish queen. Catholicism was the price. He converted, although they really remained very pagan. The Polish nobility needed a strong lord. And the Polish kings were already inviting Jews in because they wanted to create a good, sound economy. And the great currency of Poland was salt. And by the 1600s, it becomes the largest Jewish community in the world. So one door closes, another opens. You can make that case, for Jewish history right up until the Shoah.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
it's not just a history of horror. It's also a history in the reign, the first two Norman kings, in the reign of Henry II, great flourishing of culture. But the Jews would have been pretty sure their culture was superior. That's the point. Assimilation really only occurs when the world has something you want, as it's going to have after the European Enlightenment.
So did most of these Jews not remain unassimilated, or at the very least they
No,
engaged with English
they would
society,
have
but they
remained
were
in the first settlement. Who are you going to mix with?
right, right,
I
right. I mean, they
mean,
trade, they interact, they
they
speak to the
interact, of
powers
course
that
they
be.
do, but you
Yeah.
know, would you have wanted, look, if you think of in Ipswich, let's take a Jew of Ipswich. What would he have? What would the Christian population have to offer him?
Hmm.
We know there was a bit of intermarriage. Of course, there was on a human level. We know there might have been friendships. You begin to see gradually the growth of the middle classes. Until that happens, that's why in Eastern Europe there was very little assimilation. Because
Are there
right up
things?
until the 19th, 20th century, countries like areas like Ukraine, which was part of the Polish Empire, Polish
Hmm.
Lithuanian Empire, and then part of the Russian Empire, the majority of the population are peasants.
Yeah, yeah. Are there
A
elements
literate
of
middle
English?
class and a great culture. That's when Jews think, I want that. And also their
Right.
history. What the Jews had, because look, I've talked about this before, the Bar Kokhba Ben Zakkai tradition. After the terrible devastation of the Roman wars, the rabbis actually tell the Jews not to fight,
Hmm.
not to fight. And what
Yeah,
becomes the most respected soul in the Jewish world? It's not about money with the Jews, because Jews know how quickly it comes and how quickly it goes. That's the irony of it all.
yeah,
It's the restlessness of the Jew. But who
yeah.
is the hero? Right up until the modern period, who is the hero, Ollie? The Jew, the
Right.
learned one.
Sure,
The
sure.
greatest prize for any rich man's daughter has got to be the rabbi or the rabbinic student. Yes?
Yeah,
So it's a completely different life. The collision of cultures doesn't really occur. It had happened in Greeks' time, the Hellenists, because Greek culture had something to offer.
yeah, yeah,
It happens again, think the Maccabees. It happens again in the modern world, particularly in countries like Germany, which appeared to offer so much culturally.
yeah.
And
Are
also
there any?
I
Go
was
for
going
it.
to
Go
say
for
this tradition of learning meant that it gave the Jews the restlessness of the Jew, the tradition of learning. It meant also the ability to question.
it.
There's a wonderful quote of Freud. He said, "I couldn't do what I did if I'd belonged to the compact majority." Einstein said, "It what is it about me? It's just I question more than anyone else." And that's
Yeah,
such part of the Jewish tradition at its
yeah,
best.
yeah, yeah. And I'm curious, are there any elements of medieval English society, things that we know today, like, for example, Westminster Abbey and Westminster Hall, that Jews were involved in that many people just aren't aware of? I'm talking in a
Well, it's
positive
fascinating.
respect.
Merton College, Oxford, which is the oldest college in Oxford, the land, the money to buy that land by water to Merton was actually borrowed from a Jew, and I don't know if it was ever paid back.
Wow.
Old Jewry in the city of London, that was the centre of the Jewish settlement. There isn't that much. There's Aaron of Lincoln's house. There's a few things that you can see, but you have to look. You really
Yeah.
have to look.
Sure. And we're obviously in the second episode, we'll touch on the second settlement of the Jews. But could you maybe touch on just a little bit of what happens in this interval period? What happens in England? How do they fare without the Jews there?
Well, it's fascinating. You see, I think one of the reasons when the Jews came back to England, they felt that England was almost the golden Medina, is that England is going to undergo its huge convulsive changes when there are no Jews here. When I say there are no Jews, of course there would have been some. We know, for example, that Henry VII, in Tudor times, Henry VII's musicians happened to be Italian Jews. We know that Elizabeth had a doctor called Lopez, He was actually accused of trying to kill him. He was a Jew. We know that after the Ferdinand and Isabella introduced the Inquisition in Spain, when they had finally reunified, kicked out the last Muslims and reunified Spain, we know that some Spanish and Portuguese Jews came to England.
Would they have had to hide their identity?
Um, it's not sure. I'm not sure. They certainly couldn't practice as Jews, and there would be very few. After the discovery of America, when so many of the merchants and the shippers were of Jewish origin, Columbus was probably of Jewish origin. You know all about this. And many of the merchant fleets, Jews, because what happened in Spain, and I think I ought to explain this, Muslim Spain was gradually reconquered from the Muslims, and it culminates in 1492 when the last Moorish stronghold is destroyed. Ferdinand and Isabella unite Spain through marriage, Aragon and Castile. Isabella is a fanatical Catholic. Her confessor is a man called Thomas de Torquemada, who's a Dominican. What had happened was a lot of Jews had converted to Christianity to keep their positions in Spain, and they were unbelievably successful. They were the new Christians. The Inquisition never had power over Jews, but it had power over heresy. So you begin to see witch hunts, the auto da fe's. So a lot of these conversos, they flee to Portugal. Later on, they're kicked out of Portugal. So they go to the New World, or they become merchants in search of new routes. And some of them would have come to England. So that's the story of that. But going back to England, now's not the time to go through all the kings of England. Suffice to say, in Henry VIII's reign, England undergoes a seismic change. Go back to a man called Martin Luther. Look, there were already heresies against the Catholic Church, which is exacerbated by the invention of the printing press. You know, in the famous Shakespeare play Hamlet, when Hamlet, who's writing in the reign of Henry VIII's granddaughter, when Hamlet says to Ophelia, "Get thee to a nunnery," he means go to a whorehouse. That's how bad the reputation of the Catholic Church had become. In 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabella expelled the Jews from Spain, not the conversos, they're subjected to the Inquisition. Jews were not, but so kicked them out. Many of them went on the move. But the point about that expulsion is it allowed more Jews to go on the move. But I've lost my train of thought. What was the point? Oh,
Henry about the period, the intermittent period.
Okay, but what I'm talking about is the growth of the printing press, which led more Christians to realize that the Catholic Church had got it wrong. Because in 1492, what I wanted to tell you, who is Pope? Heard of a man called Alexander Borgia and his very famous son, Cesare Borgia? The Pope's a celebrant. He's got 4 kids by his favorite mistress, including Cesare Borgia, who was a great military leader, for whom Machiavelli wrote The Prince, and his daughter Lucrezia Borgia. Now, this is the reputation of the Pope. And also other popes. They were Renaissance princes. Think Michelangelo, think of the Vatican ceiling, think Leonardo da Vinci, who, by the way, it seems had a Jewish mother, but we won't go there today. So corruption in the Catholic Church led to the rise of Protestantism. Why am I going on about this? Because it's important in Jewish history. The problem with Jewish history, you've got to pick up the threads because the Jews are not in command of their own destiny. What happens is Henry VIII marries Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. She can't give him a son. And in those days, it was believed, and he had a very insecure dynasty. His father had usurped the throne. Henry VII had stolen the throne from Richard III, who he killed at Bosworth Field. Part of that, his son Henry VIII is married to the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the most powerful family in the Catholic world, particularly as their grandson was Charles V. And Charles V was the Holy Roman Emperor. He, from his mother's family, had Spain, from his father's family had much of Central Europe, the Habsburg Empire. He's a Habs. Henry wants to divorce Catherine because it was believed the sex of a child was determined by a woman. She'd given him a daughter, lots of stillbirths, and he wanted to marry his mistress, Anne Boleyn. Forget the love stuff. It's about dynasty. She was pregnant. He needs to divorce her. And he cannot get a divorce because the only way he can get a divorce is from the Pope. He had responded to Luther by writing a defense of the Catholic Church in 1521, by the way. This is really the beginnings of Protestantism. He had a very wily chancellor, Thomas More, who said to him, divorce the Pope. You see, the Pope is in cahoots with whom? The Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, who is Catherine's nephew. There's no way he's going to get a divorce, but he does divorce the Pope. So Britain, in Henry VIII's reign, becomes Protestant. And then his son, and then it goes back to his daughter, who's Catholic. Britain, right up until 1688, there is wars between Catholicism and Protestantism. There are no Jews there. It also undergoes its parliamentary revolution. Charles I, King of England, is executed by Parliament, Cromwell. So when the Jews come back in very small numbers, and who are they? They are Sephardi merchants who are very useful to Cromwell, to England that is emerging as a huge trading nation. So when they come back, they slip into England. And the Jews who come back are sophisticated Sephardi merchants who are very useful. And it's a long, slow process. There's no edict of emancipation in England. It just happens gradually. That's the British way. So when they come back to a completely different England. A theological revolution and a parliamentary revolution, and no Jews there. The problem with French and German history, Jews are there at every important change, so they can be blamed. And I would suggest to you that certainly in the world of monotheism, of course, maybe it's in human nature when there's economic, social, and political unrest to find the scapegoat. There isn't a community in Britain that hasn't been despised at one time or another. But I would suggest to you the quality of Jew hatred is different. And I'm going to stick my neck out on this, because how come they are hated by both the left and the right? And it's because of this almost mystic power that's been ascribed to the Jews historically. The reality is a powerless people. Just think the Shoah. It goes as far as some monsters have said, and still say, and in Britain as well, that the Zionists in Palestine colluded in the Holocaust to create their state. That's how evil it is. And this is trolled out by many on the left. Forget the right.
Sure.
And I think it's this mystical dimension.
Absolutely. Without
kill
question.
a god, you have to have power. You have to be a devil. Now, as I said right at the beginning, I'm not a nutcase. I do not believe that's even to the fore of most people's thinking, but it's there. Why is it? And I'm going to pose this question to our audience. Why is it that a higher standard of morality is demanded of the Jewish state than every other nation that has ever walked the world? Heard about the deaths in Syria? Heard about the numbers of Christians that are being murdered? Where are the people on the streets? Where are the people on the streets for Yemenites? Where are the people on the streets for the million murdered by the Chinese? Where are they? I'm not saying that Israel is blameless. I am not saying that. I'm not getting involved in a political debate. But Israel is a democracy. Makes mistakes like every country makes mistakes, but is a country that is fighting for survival. And I find it absolutely extraordinary that since October the 7th, when a pogrom was perpetrated that rivals the pogroms in history, not the Shoah, that there were people dancing on the streets of London even before Israel went into Gaza. What kind of world have we created? if you want the correlation to that, in Hindu India, Jew hatred does not exist. It
Mm,
doesn't exist in China either. It's in the old world of monotheism because the Jew is central.
yeah.
And the fact that
And
the
so
Jew did not
threatening.
become either Christian or Muslim is a problem. When
Yeah.
Islam is insecure, it's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that really gets to the heart of so much of this. That so much of this is actually theological, and we're seeing how theology shapes so much of England in that period that you've been speaking about, and lays those foundations for the things that you and we will see manifesting in later centuries. But Trudy, thank you so much for giving such a. I think we've definitely passed our hour here, but thank you so much for
Oh
giving
dear.
such
Oh
a
God. Sorry.
well round. No, it's been terrific. I'm just a little bit conscious of time, but I really think that you've really just done a tremendous job of giving us such a rounded understanding of this period of the first settlement, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
You know what you're going
And
to have to do? You're going to have to do what you're good at. You have to cut and clip.
there's going to be zero cutting and clipping because
Make it into
people are going to
two
love.
then.
People. We are in the era of the long form interviews and long form podcasts. People love it. But this was just absolutely terrific. We'd definitely love to know from you, the viewer, your thoughts on the kind of topics you'd like us to touch on. Also, if you have questions to Trudy, post them in the comments, and I'll ask Trudy, and I'll do my best to reply back. And maybe, who knows, maybe some of these discussions we can have as a live thing, so I can actually get comments from the viewers up.
Be lovely. That
Um,
would be lovely.
yeah,
I don't expect everyone to agree with me. I really welcome debate. I love it. Um, Also, we all will come through this, you know.
yeah,
It's a
yeah.
dark world out there, but it's cyclical.
Of
And
course it
as a
is.
very cynical friend of mine said, and I want you to think about what I'm saying now, it couldn't have been much fun living in the decline of the Roman Empire either. I think what we're actually seeing, tragically, is the decline of the West. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be one big bang. I don't believe that. But I think it's no longer fashionable in history, but it's quite, certainly in the late 19th, early 20th century, historians would attempt to look at the rise and fall of empires. And I think we are looking at the moment at the rise of, we've looked at the rise, I think we are beginning to look at the fall of the West. Whether it can be halted is another interesting question.
Yeah,
But that doesn't mean it's the end of the West. It means we're going to have to look for a different way of being and a different way of carving out our destinies.
yeah. I think it's all very unpredictable, to be honest, how
Yes,
things
it's
are going to
very
manifest.
unpredictable.
But the fact is, the thing that grounds me is when I look at Jewish history, despite having, as Mark Twain put it, our hands tied behind our backs, we always come through, survive, thrive, and to me, that gives me a great sense of confidence that so too this shall pass, as you say.
History's made us do so. The price has been absolutely horrific. But having said that, it's given us a
Not easy
restlessness.
being chosen.
That was a lovely Mark Twain quote. Next, God, and what's the quote? Next time, God, please choose someone
Do
else.
someone else, yeah. Yeah,
Okay. And we have friends. And I know we have many friends in this country. I just wish more of them would speak out now
yeah,
because we need you.
yeah, absolutely. Well, this is something
Okay.
that David Schwimmer, the actor from Friends, was saying last week. He was saying, both to Jews and non-Jews, you don't have to be political just to put your head above the parapet and say things that should be uncontroversial, like I stand with the Jewish community, and these kind of things, and just
Because we're
embracing your
living,
Jewish identity.
and because if I may, Ollie, most Jewish I know now are feeling very, very insecure.
Mm,
Um, it's affecting personally. It's affecting my children and my grandchildren, and I take that personally.
mm,
I have one grandson about to go, if he does well in his A levels, about to go to university. What is happening on our campuses, and he's not a political creature.
mm.
Why should he? Why should every Jew in Britain be expected to be a representative of the state of Israel? I happen to believe passionately in the right of Israel to exist within secure borders. That is my position. Why should my grandsons feel unsafe? It's troubling. It's troubling for all of us. And for the first time, some of my friends are thinking of moving on.
You mean
I'm being
from
quite
England?
serious. From England, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this it's. I think the point is, and maybe this could be the note to end it on. We're looking at two settlements. Who knows what the future will hold for Anglo Jewry? It's an ongoing
Mm.
story, really. But I think we'll continue this dialogue on this in part two.
Thank you, Ollie.
Um,
Thank you,
and
Ollie.
thank you so much, Trudy.
It's
Greatly,
my
greatly
pleasure,
appreciate.
darling.
Hi, thank you so much for watching. To watch another one, click here. To stay up to date with all our content, click here to subscribe. And if you're able to, you can help support JTV to grow and grow by clicking join below this video, where you can become a member and get perks including early access to videos and private live discussions with me. But most of all, you'll be partnering with us on our mission to change the world.